You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 20th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist. I'm Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, can Kamala step up?
Her story represents the best American story. And like many of our best presidents, she was also vice president. That's a joke.
As the baton is passed from Joe Biden to Kamala Harris at the Democratic Convention, we'll ask if the party's presidential nominee has what it takes to beat Donald Trump. Also ahead in the next 60 minutes, from neutral stance to full military force, we'll examine just how far Japan's security policy has changed in the face of threats from China. We'll look at the changing, complicated role of race in Brazilian politics, and I'll be joined by Monocle's Julia Lassica, who's just returned from Ukraine. Julia, welcome. What do you have for us?
I'll be talking about the capital's buzzing hospitality scene and how the country is dealing with an overabundance of watermelon.
We look forward to it. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. Washington's top diplomat, Antony Blinken, says Israel has accepted what he called an American bridging proposal for a ceasefire deal in Gaza. A search operation is ongoing off the coast of Sicily for 6 people who were on board a luxury yacht which sank after a heavy storm. And the disgraced former Republican Congressman George Santos has pleaded guilty to wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He almost now certainly faces a jail term. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, Kamala Harris delivered a surprise speech last night following her endorsement by members of the Democratic Party as their choice to run for US president. At the party's national convention in Chicago, she was joined on stage by Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. The Democrats have been in a buoyant mood ever since the sitting president, Joe Biden, announced he was stepping aside, uniting behind the candidate he endorsed, Vice President Harris. Well, from Chicago, correspondent Simon Mark sent us this report.
Delegates streaming into the United Centre for the first night of this 4-day made-for-TV spectacular were in ebullient mood. A stark contrast to what they may have expected to be feeling just 5 weeks ago, before President Joe Biden's decision to abandon his re-election campaign. Luciano Garza is a convention delegate from Texas.
I'm feeling great. We're motivated. We're optimistic about our ticket. We're joyful. We finally have great positive energy.
And Terry Andreski says she feels the same way. She's a delegate from Illinois.
I'm very excited about it. I'm really glad the way things happened in the news, because I think Kamala has a much better chance of winning this election now than Joe Biden did.
The polls agree. Only on Monday, a fresh Fox News survey showed Kamala Harris has opened up a 6-point lead over Donald Trump among likely voters. It's the largest margin Democrats have enjoyed in this race. She will be hoping that this convention cements it in place, carrying her all the way to November and notching up the historic achievement that eluded one speaker on night one.
I want my grandchildren and their grandchildren to know I was here at this moment, that we were here, and that we were with Kamala Harris every step of the way. This is our time, America. This is when we stand up. This is when we break through. The future is here. It's in our grasp. Let's go win it.
Hillary Clinton showed no sign of any bittersweet feelings at the path fate dealt her with her 2016 loss to Donald Trump. 8 years later, Delegate Terry Andreski from Illinois says the time for a woman president is now.
I absolutely think that we are ready for a female president. We're ready for a female Black Asian president. And yes, this country is getting smaller and smaller as world travel is getting more and more social media. The younger generation think nothing of that. So yes, we are definitely ready.
Among the convention attendees, we found Congressman Dean Phillips of Minnesota. 10 months ago, he shocked Democrat grandees by challenging Joe Biden for the party's presidential nomination, saying it was time to pass the torch to a younger generation. Excoriated then by the party's elders, he told Monocle Radio that he now feels vindicated.
I am celebrating. After having gone through some tough months trying to call attention to an issue that I thought needed to be addressed many months ago. Now, would I have liked this to have happened 9 months ago when I ran? Of course. But, we can't always achieve what we want as quickly as we want. I'm thrilled that the objective, half of it, has been met, which is to replace the top of the ticket, the whole ticket. And now, if we win on November 5th, that will be the comprehensive result that I was looking for. It wasn't about me. It was about it and demonstrating that this was a time for courage.
Long live Palestine!
Like other delegates attending this convention, Phillips could not have been unaware of the thousands of protesters seeking to encircle it. They want to force a change in the party's position on Gaza and are vowing to be here every day this week in increasing numbers, posing the biggest potential fly in Kamala Harris's ointment. On Tuesday night, the Democrats will bring out the big guns. Former President Barack Obama and former First Lady Michelle Obama are the keynote speakers, sure to offer Kamala Harris full-throated support as she prepares later this week to stake her claim to the leadership of the party. For Monocle Radio, I'm Simon Marks at the Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Thank you, Simon. Well, I'm joined now in the studio by Chris Chermak, Monocle's senior news editor. Good morning, Chris. How are things going?
Well, it's been a long night, hasn't it? I was kind of surprised to wake up this morning thinking I would watch the reruns of the DNC convention, and it turned out Biden was still speaking when I woke up.
Okay, yeah. It has been somewhat of a marathon. But there's this moment, I'm just listening to what Simon was doing just there. There just seems to be this collective sigh of relief that what should have happened, especially in the eyes of Dean Phillips, eventually did happen, and there's a security and a confidence in the tenure, the timbre, and just the way that the Democrats feel right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me watching that as well, what was interesting was, on the one hand, this has been an incredible 4 to 5 weeks in American politics with Joe Biden stepping aside. But when you watch tonight and you watch the staging of the event in Chicago, the feeling was, this is what should have been all along, right? This is the way that the first day of the Democratic Convention should have gone. Joe Biden had always said he was a bridge. He was this transitional candidate to a new generation. That's what he said in 2020. And then for a while, he decided to change his mind on that and that he was going to run for another 4 years in office. That then now shifted, and now he was back to that first day giving the speech about his accomplishments, everything he had achieved, and then handing off to the new generation. And that's the way this should have been. It just worked far better than if he would have been on the Thursday instead of the Monday.
Because this was Biden's swan song, wasn't it? I mean, the tears were there, the list of the accomplishments. It was really, really detailed. I mean, there was gratitude for the family. There was pride in what he's done in the domestic agenda. Lots of contrasts with President Trump, outright calling him a loser. I mean, this was someone who really wanted to be able to pass the baton to Harris on a very, very sure footing.
Yes, absolutely. And also kind of went through his own career. I think one of the key lines towards the end was when he talked about that I was too young to be senator and too old to be president. This was the sign of sort of how long his own arc had been. He was under 30 years old when he first went into politics. So that was the sign in itself. So this was about him. He talked to Democrats, but also to America. I gave my best to you was his line. So yes, this was a celebration of him tonight. Thank you, Joe chants going out throughout the entire thing. But at the same time, yes, absolutely, that handing off to Harris.
And the way he handed it to Harris was done very eloquently. I think we have a little clip of him.
Her story represents the best American story. And like many of our best presidents, she was also vice president. That's a joke.
I mean, just talking about the way that they've actually managed to change the presidential ticket just a few months before the election, there was a slight sense of panic before this was happening, but there seemed to be a very, very strong natural handing over there. And one now wonders where Kamala Harris has to stand, because she has a very tough act to follow in terms of surety, knowledge, experience. Is she a decent enough candidate in her own right?
Well, that is absolutely going to be the question, isn't it? Because, I mean, it has been incredible to watch how quickly Democrats have coalesced around Kamala Harris, how they have reset the Democratic convention to talk about her, to define her. That's what these 4 days are going to be about. You saw that in this first day in Chicago. But at the same time, the reasons that there were concerns about her still stand, that she is ineffective, not perhaps inexperienced. She's also been vice president. She's done a lot of things, but she has not always been the one who was present and effectual. She will be giving speeches over these 4 days. She will sort of let her voice be heard. She can do the soaring rhetoric, but I think that will be the interesting part going forward, to look at whether she can prove that she really has what it takes to be president. I think that's what Republicans are going to be hammering her on as well until November.
There was another very bittersweet moment on the stage. I think we heard it a moment ago in Simon Marks's report. Hillary Clinton, the sort of the eternal bridesmaid when it comes to the presidency, sort of handing over again the next generation to the woman who is much more likely to become the first female president of the United States. And it felt like there was a sort of a generational... It seems different this time around. I think Hillary Clinton came across as too different, too abrasive, whatever it was that stopped her from getting the job. Kamala Harris now, as potentially the first woman, it seems a lot more of a natural progression and choice. There seems so much more change.
Yeah, I think it was interesting the way that Hillary Clinton phrased that, because she really drew the arc, which I thought was very well done from her, talking about her mother being born 104 years ago when women did not have the right to vote in the United States, to then the first people who ran for president before her, Geraldine Ferraro as well becoming the first vice presidential candidate, she then running in 2016. So she kind of set up this, the chinks in the glass ceiling, and then Kamala Harris will be the one to finally break through that glass ceiling. So yes, that is absolutely, and must be bittersweet for her. I think some of that bittersweetness came out, frankly, when there was a bit of an awkward moment where the crowd started chanting, "Lock him up" for Donald Trump, and she was sort of basking in that, you felt, after, of course, "Lock her up" was the chant against her. But yes, I think she very much, there would have been some bittersweetness, but she did this very well, and there is a more natural step. You could argue, we will see how things go, of course, but there is a natural step now to Kamala Harris.
Thanks for that, Chris. What else are you going to be looking at as the day progresses? You're back behind the microphone here in a couple of hours, aren't you?
I will be back behind the microphone for the briefing in a few hours. We'll be looking back at the DNC as well with more reports and more coverage. Laura Kramer from Monocle will be joining us, so we'll have the two Americans at Monocle discussing the way forward, what we thought of the DNC and the convention. There'll be plenty more to come, of course, on the convention throughout the day here on Monocle Radio, and the next few days we'll also hear from our US editor, Chris Lord, who has just arrived there as well.
We look forward to it. Chris Cermak, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. This is The Globalist. .13 in Tokyo, 7:13 a.m. here in London. It seems perhaps a distant memory now that just a few years ago, Japan's military policy was one of neutrality, a deliberate distancing in the aftermath of World War II. Events, however, have succeeded in eating away at this. And to tell us more, I'm joined by Isabel Hilton, China expert and visiting professor at King's College London. A very good morning to you. Welcome back, Isabel.
Thank you. Wonderful to be here. And good morning to you.
So just tell us we've talked about arcs of narrative a moment ago when we were talking about the story of the Democratic Party. But let's talk about another arc of narrative here, where Japan has moved from and to in the last, let's say, 5 to 6 years.
Well, as you say, Japan after the war had essentially a pacifist constitution imposed on it by the United States, because Japan had been the great threat to peace and security in Asia. But fast forward to today, the configuration looks very different. So as a result of that pacifist constitution, Japan became what the United States called the unsinkable aircraft carrier. So the United States committed to the defense of Japan. in the event of an attack without Japan having to commit to the defence of the United States. So it wasn't exactly an Article 5 NATO arrangement, but it was a very close and is a very close security arrangement, which means that the United States has something like 50,000 troops stationed in Okinawa and the Japanese island. Now, what changed recently? Of course, the relations between Japan and China were never exactly warm after the war, but they were sort of tolerable. But the shift in the position of, and particularly the relationship between China and Russia, has caused a really radical rethink in Japan. And it's been a bit of a process because there's a lot of public hostility to changing the military stance. But over time, that has become, I think the Japanese now see this as inevitable. So when, for example, when Russia and China declared eternal friendship and then Russia invaded Ukraine, Japan's position was significant because it joined in sanctions, it condemned the invasion, and it worsened a really historically toxic relationship between Russia and Japan. They have a dispute over the Kuril Islands, which Japan claims Russia seized after World War II. And we've seen over the past 5 years a ramping up of the kind of harassment and niggling that happens with territorial claims. We've seen steady joint Russia-China military exercises, which happen very close to Japan. And Japan, as the closest ally of the United States in the region, is attracting the hostility of both China and Russia, and is just beginning to rethink its position as a result.
It is an astonishing thought to think that a conflict that is, a good 9,500 kilometres away in Ukraine has almost forced Japan to reposition itself and then find itself asserting itself militarily and in a security way, in a way that perhaps we wouldn't have thought of a few years ago.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. But it was the combination. I think Japan had tried in the past to make an alliance with China against Russia or with Russia against China. It was always regarded as the kind of buffering of one against the other. But the fact that the two of them are now in a close alliance really left Japan exposed, and it has reinforced Japan's position, as I say, as the prime American proxy in the region. And as such, it has very little choice but to look to its own defence. And hence we see a whole series of arrangements coming into play of minilateral security arrangements, which Japan has joined. And I think this is a pattern that isn't going to change unless the Russia-China alliances changes or Russia goes down to defeat in Ukraine. But we've seen some fairly extraordinary things, like the visit of a Japanese prime minister, the current Japanese prime minister, to Kyiv, and the pledging of support, in fact, the giving of quite substantial financial support. Japan's constitution still prohibits Japan from exporting weapons to a conflict zone. But there is talk, for example, of Japan sending Patriot missiles to the United States, which would mean that the United States could liberate some of its own Patriot missiles for Ukraine. So it's pretty proactive as a policy.
And it also means that Japan can quite legitimately call on Europe to help if there were any kind of conflict to emerge with China.
Well, again, that's a mutual dependence, because if NATO, if European powers are going to operate in Asia, they need bases, and certainly Japan is an obvious base. I think that's that is much discussed. In practice, how much NATO would really operate other than the United States, would really operate in Asia is still open to question. But Japan has attended NATO summits. There are warm noises between NATO and Japan. So I think that the alliance factor is very clear. And of course, Japan stands to suffer, as most of the world does, if there is a conflict in Taiwan, because, like China, Japan is at the end of a lot of sea lanes which go through the Taiwan Strait and go through the South China Sea. And again, China's increased assertiveness in the South China Sea is another factor that has made Tokyo really quite nervous of its position.
Tell us how this resolves itself? I mean, you mentioned the fact that post-war China and Japan did not have the warmest of relationships, but we saw last month the Chinese foreign minister and the Japanese foreign minister meeting in Laos at ASEAN. And one hoped that there was some sort of dialogue going on. I mean, what are the lines of communication like?
Well, they've never exactly been severed. I mean, after the war, Japan made a considerable effort to, as it were, make it up with China. A lot of investment, a lot of reparations, a lot of goodwill, and it varied. The state of relations varied depending on the mood of Beijing. Really, the Japanese position was pretty consistent, although there were constant tensions over Japan's attitude to its own history, which is problematic. Unlike the post-war European situation, there was never a complete resolution of historic grievances in Asia. Japan has quite a warm relationship with Taiwan, ironically enough. Taiwan was Japan's first colony, and one in which they wanted to build into an exemplary colony as the first building block of the greater Asian prosperity sphere, as Japan called its attempt at empire building across Asia. And curiously enough, I think Taiwan and Japan retain warm relations. Japan and Russia never managed to agree a peace deal after World War II because of the constant argument over the Kuril Islands, which Russia seized and has never given back, and indeed has expelled Japanese citizens from the Kuril Islands. It recently banned Japanese fishing boats from the Kuril Islands. So we've got a sort of triangle of niggling going on, in which China is firmly on the side of Russia, but is trying, I think, to maintain at least conversations with Japan, because it wouldn't want a war on two fronts.
Isabel Hilton, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
1 in 4 candidates in Brazil's local elections, so more than 42,000 candidates, have changed their registered skin color.
Monocle Radio senior correspondent Fernanda Augusta Pacheco will explain the complexity of race in Brazilian politics. Stay tuned.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me on the line from Paris is Agnès Parrier, a journalist and author of Notre Dame, the Soul of France. Good morning. Bonjour, Agnès. How are you?
I'm very well. And you?
How is Paris this morning? Because you fled during the Olympics, or the second week, didn't you? Have you found the courage to return?
Oh, yes, I'm back. I actually came back straight after the opening ceremony when friends said, well, by the way, it's fantastic. So I wasn't away for a very long time. Well, this morning, hazy, but I think it's going to be a beautiful day. Yeah, I can see the sun, piercing through the haze.
OK, the weather report, courtesy of Agnès Parrier, delivered elegantly there. Let's have a look at some of the papers. And looking at Le Monde to start off with, we're now back in, bringing up the political rumblings again. And everybody's wondering why Emmanuel Macron has failed to work out who his next prime minister is going to be.
Well, yes, the magic of the Olympic Games is slightly, disappearing. So, yes, back to square one. We don't have a government, or rather we have a government, but it's certainly dealing with, current affairs, etc., but we don't have a new government. So Le Monde is really, drumming up the frustration, especially of the Left Alliance, saying, when on earth is President Macron going to appoint a new prime minister? But really, everybody's on holiday. And if you are in Paris, then you can see that. But nevertheless, President Macron is going to meet with all the leaders of the different groups at the Parliament this Thursday. But I would be surprised if he was going to appoint a prime minister soon, because the problem is, the parliament is rather central in that matter. But it is also very weak. There is no majority. There are only 3 minorities, and it is unprecedented. There's no precedent for it. And it's a completely novel situation. And the Constitution says that the president appoints the prime minister, not the parliament. And also Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the supremo of the far left, has launched a sort of new attack against the president, saying that they were going to suggest an impeachment which requires 2/3 of the parliament and will never pass. So this is another distraction. And it also divides the left alliance because the socialists, the communists and the Greens are opposing that idea from Jean-Luc Mélenchon. So I don't know when France will next have a prime minister. So it's a question of still of building a grand coalition, but who is going to manage this first?
How much control does Macron have over this? I mean, the article in Le Monde talks about him relishing the idea of being the master of clocks, insofar as we will all have to wait for him. And he's talked about political truces and interludes that mean that the politics takes a step back while the Olympics shine. I mean, is Macron able to hold on to this control?
Well, it's the Constitution, really. I mean, Le Monde is rather has always been very critical of President Macron. But if you look at the Constitution, that's what a French president, whether it's Macron or anybody else, he appoints the prime minister. The problem is, when it was what we call the cohabitation in the 80s and 90s with François Mitterrand, it was very clear. There was an absolute majority in parliament. If there was one of the political bloc had a majority in parliament, it would have been done in 48 hours. But President Macron, it's not clear for anyone who has most legitimacy to actually govern. And the Left Alliance is not. It certainly came first, if you like, as an alliance, because the only party really who came first is the National Front, or rather National Rally. It will be very difficult for them, even if President Macron appoints Lucie Castet, who is this young woman who the Left Alliance would like President Macron to appoint. It will be very difficult for them to actually pass any laws in Parliament simply because they don't have a majority. So an idea of a broader coalition is really a must. But France is not known for a spirit of compromise.
Let's have a look at another story. We were talking about the sort of the aftermath of the Olympics. There's a great article in Le Monde this week that says calm, bored Paris hopes for returned fervour during the Olympics. Venues dedicated to the Olympics, including the Parc des Nations at La Villette, are deserted by visitors who totalled more than 1 million during the celebrations. The dust is settling a bit, isn't it? In anticipation of the Paralympics, let's be clear. But what people are sort of like pulling back after the joy a bit, aren't they?
Yes, they are. I mean, you'll find a lot of articles in the press saying we must keep that spirit, we must retain the joy. Well, for the moment, Paris is just deserted. And there are a few grumpy hoteliers and restaurateurs who are actually sending all their compensation requests that are piling up on a desk somewhere at the Élysée Palace or somewhere else in a ministry. And because they say actually they lost a lot of money, or they made more money during COVID than during the Paris Games. They talk about the security, the grey zone that we had for a week before the opening ceremony. They talk about those high fences that meant that their cafe was not accessible, etc., etc. So yes, disgruntled French people are sort of being more vocal. But let's hope the Paralympics in a few weeks' time will restore some of that joy.
Agnès Poirier, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Paris. The time here in London is 7:29. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. Let's have a quick look at what else we're following today. Washington's top diplomat Antony Blinken says Israel has accepted what he called an American bridging proposal for a ceasefire deal in Gaza. He said it was now up to Hamas to agree to it. Speaking after talks with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Mr. Blinken said there was a deep sense of urgency to get the proposal agreed. A search operation is ongoing off the coast of Sicily for 6 people who were on board a luxury yacht which sank after a heavy storm. 1 man has died. The tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch and his daughter among the missing. The wreckage of the Bayesian yacht is now on the seabed. And the disgraced former Republican Congressman George Santos has pleaded guilty to wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He now almost certainly faces a jail term. Santos became the first member of Congress to be expelled in more than 20 years after making false claims about a career on Wall Street, his university education, his Jewish ancestry, and his mother's death in the 9/11 attacks. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 7:30 here in London now. Turkey is to send a ship to the coast of Somalia to explore for oil. The purpose is twofold: to help Ankara diversify the source of crude, but just as crucially, it offers ties in a region where the likes of China and Moscow are vying for influence over minerals and growing populations. Well, I'm joined now once again by Hannah Lucinda Smith, Monocle's Istanbul correspondent. A very good morning to you, Hannah. How's Istanbul looking today?
Good morning. It is hot here in Istanbul, as usual in summer.
No great surprise there. Now, tell us about this ship.
Turkey was really quick back in 2011 when Somalia suffered that terrible famine to get in there really quickly and build these kind of humanitarian supplies. Erdogan was also the first country leader to visit Somalia after its civil war. And since then, Turkey's really made this kind of diplomatic push and also military push. It's opened a huge training base close to Mogadishu. It's working very closely with the Somalian security forces, particularly in their fight against al-Shabaab. There's also huge commercial interests there. Turkish companies run the airport in Mogadishu, also the seaport. If you go to Mogadishu, you'll see all kinds of Turkish brands in the shops. And now also Turkey wants to get involved in the exploration for oil off Somalia's coast. Now, Somalia's also become a bit of a stepping stone for Turkey into Africa more widely. Following on from Somalia, we've also seen Erdogan and his ministers making a lot of outreach visits around Africa, also pushing these kind of military deals, particularly for the Bayraktar drone, which is Turkey's kind of, shopfront defence export, let's say. So this is really part of a kind of, bigger trend towards Turkey trying to make footprints in Africa. But really, it's a very, very significant development.
I mean, it's an interesting thing when you talk about Turkey trying to make its footprint, because what you have just described is of a country which has a long-term presence in Somalia. And the idea of bringing schools and Turkish language centres to Somalia is something which is perhaps not new. So what fresh opportunities does Turkey see here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is part of what Turkey sees as its kind of sphere of influence, the old Ottoman Empire, particularly Muslim countries, as well as the economic benefits that it can bring to Turkey. And if we look again at Somalia over the past 10 years, it's about $1 billion worth of trade between those two countries. It's a significant amount. But on top of that, there's also the kind of cultural capital that they can win from that. And that's through things like the Turkish language schools, through the figure of Tayyip Erdogan himself. And it's this idea of Turkey becoming a kind of leading country within the Muslim world, and particularly of Tayyip Erdogan becoming this kind of leading sort of figurehead for Sunni Muslims, not just in Turkey, but also in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, and places like Pakistan as well.
And indeed, we're also talking security as well, aren't we? Because we've got Ankara combining cooperation in the fields of intelligence, defence, and as well we have deals in mining and energy sectors. I mean, there is very much a stance that this more activist foreign policy approach could take on the likes of Russia and China, or are they really quite punching above their weight here?
I think what's really interesting is this is a kind of almost third era of foreign policy in Erdogan's tenure. In the early years, there was really a push in Turkey towards the sort of soft diplomacy, not having these kind of rows with neighbours, and using, the old shared Ottoman history, Turkish culture, Turkish language, these kind of soft power tools to really expand Turkey's influence in the traditional region, so in places like the Balkans, but also the Middle East, also North Africa. Then after 2011, it became a much more kind of muscular, traditional, hard power foreign policy. So when we saw movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, which Erdogan is very sympathetic towards, rising up in the Arab Spring protests, Turkey was very, very forward about supporting some of those armed movements, particularly in Syria, and then latterly also sending its own army into Libya, also into Syria, also into the Caucasus. And now we're seeing a bit of a kind of return to the soft power, aspect, but also with that hard power in there as well. It's a kind of mix of the two. So the hard power obviously comes from, the sort of joint training, the army bases that Turkey's setting up in Africa, and also the weapons sales. But it's really got a heavy dose of that soft power in there as well. They don't want to be seen, perhaps as Russia or China might, just kind of coming in a very mercantile way and looking for those kind of mineral deals. They also want to be seen as a country that's got this kind of, historical interest, religious interest, and also ethical interest in Africa.
There's also the very practical requirement of needing to move away from energy imports from the likes of Russia and Iran.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that is really, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's hampered Turkey, but has certainly been a massive consideration in its policies when it's gone about dealing with Iran and Russia. It does rely almost exclusively on energy imports. It's been trying to turn itself into an energy transit country with some success. But really, Turkey does need to either find its own reserves, which it's been trying to do in the Black Sea and also in the Aegean, much to the consternation of Cyprus and Greece, but also to try and diversify its foreign supply as well.
Hannah Lucinda Smith, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. 8:37 in Zurich, 7:37 here in London. I'm joined now from Florence by Paul Charles, founder and CEO of luxury travel and trade consultancy, the PC Agency, and the former director of Virgin Atlantic and Eurostar, for an update on the latest news of the world from aviation. Good morning, Charles. Good morning, Paul. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
Good to have you with us. Tell us a little bit about this news that's emerging, or these developments, I should say, that emerging, that European airlines seem to be doing a better job of using cleaner fuel than the Americans. How does that work?
Well, what you've seen in Europe over the last few years is very much more of a sort of carrot and stick approach, I think, to development, to developing cleaner fuels, to integrating them within airlines. And obviously, we're seeing the move towards more sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF as it's known. And it's been not only more readily available in Europe, but also there's been a desire by many leaders within European airlines to really move faster than American colleagues. So you've seen the likes of Air France, KLM, Finnair and IAG move more quickly to get supplies of SAF within their fleet, albeit still at very low levels.
Indeed. I mean, the levels that we are talking about are pretty small, aren't they? I think
yes.
just looking at some of the figures, it says that the use of sustainable aviation fuel has grown from 0.04% of global aviation fuel in 2021 to 0.17% in 2023. Yes, it's a big jump, but still within a very small parameter.
A very small parameter. And it does, of course, mean that airlines are unlikely to hit their sort of goal of 10% by 2030, 10% of their fuel being SAF, certainly on a global basis. Clearly, governments in Europe are mandating as well. They're mandating that airlines have to use 2% of SAF by 2025. But it's hard for airlines to get hold of enough SAF, with more airlines trying to do it, with very few factories producing it, and indeed with the airport infrastructure simply not good enough, simply not having the right cables, the right wiring to be able to supply SAF to aircraft quickly so they can turn around those flights quickly, then it's understandable why it's so low. Of course, in America, the position is much worse. Again, not enough factories producing it, the airport infrastructure not being available, and actually a desire among the leadership to focus on customer service and expansion rather than integrate cleaner fuel.
It does sound like there is going to need a wholesale overhaul of the way that aircraft are fuelled before we can actually make any big leaps and bounds here.
Yes, you need that infrastructure in place. I think also you're starting to see other forms emerge. You're starting to see electric aircraft being trialled on short hops, very short haul journeys. It's a long way off before you'll be flying electric long haul, but actually not that far off before you'll be flying, say, from Finland to Sweden on an electric plane carrying 20 or 30 people. So it could be that SAF is overtaken in future by the rapid development of electric.
If you could you bring us a follow-up on the plane crash that resulted in more than 60 people dying a little over a week ago in Brazil? What's happened since?
Yes, this is obviously a very sad story involving the Brazilian carrier Volpass, which has been placed under special supervision measures by the local aviation authority there after those sad 62 deaths. It was a turboprop, if you remember, that crashed. The thinking now is that possibly ice formed on the wings and it hadn't been de-iced, and that brought the plane down. So they're still investigating that domestic flight and what happened. But when it's under special supervision, what that means essentially is the authorities are concerned about its operations, the way it maintains the aircraft, its processes. And so it will be under special supervision for some time to ensure it's putting the right measures in place before its aircraft take off.
Finally, let's talk about the connected nature of airports. You look at somewhere like New York and you look at somewhere like Tokyo, and you would assume that they probably have a high level of being able to send passengers from A to B without having to change planes. They're nowhere near the top 20, which has just been published. Tell us who won.
This is a fascinating table of a set of data that's just been produced by Cirium, the aviation analyst. And they're showing that the best connected airport in the world is Istanbul, with 309 non-stop destinations it flies to. That, of course, is partly because of the rapid expansion of Turkish Airlines there. But yes, Istanbul is top, followed by Frankfurt with 296 non-stop destinations, Paris Charles de Gaulle at 282, and Amsterdam Schiphol at 270. There is no American airport in the top three. The next is Chicago with 270, and Heathrow has fallen down the league table now with 221 non-stop destinations available. But it's a major win for Istanbul, which of course has built that fantastic new airport in the city, and it's showing that it can process passengers very seamlessly.
Paul, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. That was Paul Charles. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
8:43 in Zurich, 7:43 here in London. You're back with The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. Now, this October, Brazilians vote in local elections. And this week, it's revealed that many candidates, 1 out of 4 candidates, in fact, have changed their skin colour compared with the previous election. Well, what are the reasons behind that? Well, Monocle Radio's senior correspondent, Fernanda Augusto Pacheco, explains the complexity of race in Brazilian politics.
Brasil. Meu Brasil brasileiro.
What's the color of my skin? That question lingered throughout my childhood and teenage years. Despite my birth certificate claiming I was white for some reason, Was the person writing it a bit tipsy on caipirinha, perhaps? Joking aside, I decided to stick with pardo, which in Brazil roughly translates to mixed race. I'm bringing this up because of a shocking statistic in this week's news. 1 in 4 candidates in Brazil's local elections, so more than 42,000 candidates, have changed their registered skin color. The shifts are striking. 40% switched from white to mixed, a third switched from mixed to white, and 15% from mixed to black. These numbers might seem wild, but in Brazil, race is incredibly fluid. You might wonder why so many candidates are altering their registered skin color. For some, it's easy to exploit electoral quotas for black and mixed race candidates, but the majority of these changes don't actually interfere with their candidacy standings, so it's more complex than that. Brazil is gradually becoming more aware of racial issues, which were rarely discussed in the past, despite our painful history of slavery, racism, and social inequality. Personally, I was adopted as a baby, so only after doing a DNA test did I discover more about my diverse origins, a blend of European, African, indigenous, and even a small percentage of Asian ancestry. I think this is a common dilemma for many Brazilians, so perhaps we shouldn't be too quick to judge the local politicians changing the racial registration. For Monocle, I'm Fernando Augusto Pacheco.
It's time now to talk TV news with Scott Bryan, TV critic and broadcaster. I'm delighted to say he joins me now. Good morning, Scott.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us. Let's talk about Phil Donahue, the man who pretty much changed live debate television.
He did. He sadly passed away over the course of the weekend. He was groundbreaking in terms of broadcasting. Pretty much invented the form that I think many of us take for granted, the daytime talk show. Now, in 1960s America, back then, a lot of TV aimed at mostly women at home, of course, housewives back then, was primarily kind of circled around sort of game shows and kind of like low-brow television, soap operas, dramatic in their storylines, not really intellectual. Phil Donahue, a talk show host, knew that there was an opportunity to actually have something a bit more democratic, a bit more intellectual, and he kind of invented the art form that Oprah and many other TV shows, Jerry Springer and countless others have taken on since, which is the sort of casual exploration into different social issues. Everything from talking about the HIV and AIDS crisis, which I think he was one of the first people to do it, to talking about to bringing on presidents and bringing on presidential candidates and quizzing them. He was also one of the first people to, I think, invent the celebrity interview in terms of having celebrities candidly talking to a daytime audience about their lives. We had people like Elton John, who was very frank and quite open about talking about the troubles within his own personal life at that time, and sort of maybe shining a bit more of an authentic light. And of course, this was an art form that then others, particularly Oprah, then took and ran with.
Indeed, and the fact it remains, and there's some brilliant articles about him, is that the way that he changed, and in particular, the way that he changed television was that ability to bring the audience in and also to ask questions that others probably would not have dared to do. There was, some are saying, a sort of a shamelessness to his approach.
There was a shamelessness to his approach. I mean, he would invite on everybody, but there was something, I think, so inherently democratic about that. I mean, he said himself that he quickly realised that why is he the person with the microphone when actually the person asking the right questions are the audience. So a lot of the time, it would be him passing the microphone to them to go and be asking the questions. And I think it was the fact that this was the first time in which, at a time before the internet, when people didn't really know that many other people outside their own social circle, this was the opportunity to ask questions to people who they'd never really met before. And I think that kind of really broke ground in a way that led to a lot more understanding. And And I think it's just that casual way of just paving the way to others. I think all different types of TV all harks back to somebody coming with an idea decades earlier who people might not know. And Phil, we're lucky enough that he was one person who we did know.
Let's move on to a story in the Financial Times. Sports streaming venture from Disney, Fox and Warner blocked by a US judge. Are we massively surprised about that?
Not particularly. I mean, this is going to be. It was dubbed Venu, which is another streaming service with a terrible name. And this was a plan to have sports kind of aimed at audiences who maybe hadn't been kind of tempted over by streaming, but hadn't kind of ditched the cord, aka in America hadn't sort of given up on their cable subscribers, because they've had a big dive, but people are still tuning into live sports. So ESPN, Warner Brothers and Fox, and those huge rivals really trying to go and join together to go and make up this new streaming service or this new sports service, only for a US judge to get blocked. Now, one of the people who are most complaining about this happened to be one of their competitors. But I think it is also, kind of pointing towards a larger issue within streaming and broadcasting at the moment, which is, do streamers and broadcasters work together to help navigate this massive change in our viewing habits, or do they go it alone? Because I think if they do it together, then sometimes it can work, but also sometimes it can be seen to be anti-competitive, because of course they get to set the prices. Viewers might not find it flexible enough for what they actually want, and it means that they might get hefty fees. But also for the services, if the consumers have too much power and they can ditch and switch as much as they would like, then of course the companies are incredibly weaker, because they might get kind of outdone by another competitor, or they might not get the services that viewers actually want. So I think this sort of paves the way to a larger existential issue.
I mean, there's the eternal question, as well as actually how much money and control and value does a consumer actually get out of this? Because since the broadcasting rights to so many events were splintered, you end up having to pay 3, 4, 5-fold for something that you used to get in one service.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, I think it's become a problem in the UK, particularly for football users. I think it all used to be tied up with one broadcaster, and then it's since been split across 2 or 3. But I think particularly in America, there has been a bit of a backlash towards it, particularly around NFL, which in American football, that there has been, because it's been split according to, I think I read somewhere about 4 or 5 places to at least see everything. And there's even now plans that Apple TV Plus, which does not normally do live sports, is also planning on picking up NFL. So I'm thinking, my word, if you're actually actively trying to follow every single thing as a hardcore fan, it can end up becoming incredibly expensive, prohibitively expensive even.
Scott Brown, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. It's 7:52 here in London. Now, the summer season is wrapping up in Ukraine, a country that remains very much in tune with the rhythms of the agricultural calendar. I'm delighted to say that joining me in the studio, making herself comfortable. Good morning, Monocle's Julia Lassica, recently in Kyiv, taking stock of the capital's buzzing hospitality scene. Good morning, Julia. I can't tell you how nice it is to talk about hospitality in Kyiv, other than the usual stuff that we run here on Monocle Radio. Understandably, it's not about hospitality, it's about conflict, but it's lovely to have you with us to talk about the good stuff.
Thank you so much for having me, yeah.
Right, tell us, you've just come back from your travels, wheels have just touched down from Kyiv. What's it like out there in terms of people's capacity and ability to enjoy summer?
I think that people can enjoy summer. Like, you can always enjoy summer. I mean, London during the Blitz, people were still going out probably and, enjoying the beauty of the warm summer months. But I think that, yeah, there's a necessity to be able to enjoy the products that are growing in your garden, the flowers out on the street, the kind of warm summer light, because they need to sort of find the optimism where they can, and just soak up that energy that the sun is giving them at the moment.
And you have that delightful thing. Well, tell us, the agricultural situation in Ukraine. Obviously, an awful lot of the ground that was used to grow things is used for a very, very, very different purpose, an existential, destructive battle going on. So what does Ukraine do? What has Ukraine managed to produce this year, despite the fact that so many fields have turned into battlefields?
Yeah, so it's a really complex situation at the moment. There aren't just active battles going on the fields, but there are also in the south, which is the Ukrainian that's why Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe and the world. So many grains are being grown there, and also watermelons, Ukraine's sort of iconic fruit. And if there aren't active battlefields going on there, then there are documented many instances of Russians shelling those fields, burning the crops on purpose in order to kind of lower the yield, lower how much Ukraine is able to grow, and also mining fields. So farmers have to come up with really creative solutions. And there are so many incredible documented instances on Instagram and on social media where farmers are sharing how they've managed to demine their fields, created contraptions with their tractors. So the situation is complex, but Ukraine is still managing to grow plenty of crops which are being shipped out. People said that they wouldn't be able to happen, but Ukraine is managing to ship them out through the Black Sea and into Europe, also through road routes and train routes. And the crops are making their way, to African countries, to Asian countries, where Ukraine is actually quite a big supplier of important grains.
But that ability to enjoy your own produce, it brings, the eating together and breaking bread together brings a tremendous sense of peacefulness to it, doesn't it? How much does that give Ukraine a boost at this time?
Yeah, it's absolutely one of the most important joys. And I think it's always been a joy of the Ukrainian table. Every country, of course, has their kind of culinary delights. But in Ukraine, I was just at my one of my relatives' house, and she has this quite a small garden by London standards, but it's just overflowing, plums, pears, apples, I'm forgetting all the English words for the fruits, berries and strawberries and all sorts of things. And then she laid this beautiful table out with all of these dishes that she'd made from these incredible fruits and vegetables in her garden. And I think that there's a pride, there's always been a Ukrainian pride, but now particularly there's a pride that life can go on, that despite shelling, despite, almost nightly attacks on Kyiv, for example, where my relative is based, they can still put food on the table and they can still be self-sufficient. I think that there have been many moments in Ukrainian history where Ukrainians have been, one notable moment where, for example, in the 1930s, where Ukraine was denied, food to put on the table. And so there's this resilience in being able to feed yourself despite everything that's kind of going on around you.
And tell us, it's not just creating your own food, but there's a healthy restaurant scene in there, I would imagine. How are restaurants sort of managing to thrive and be exciting and new here?
Yeah, so, that all started after the 2014 revolution, when there was a revolution to stay on track to join Europe and to move away from Russia. And that's when the restaurant scene in Kyiv just exploded. It was incredible. I remember going back that summer and we went to these secret bars and to these shopping malls, and, you'd step in and it would just be like you're entering a different world, and the food would just be beautiful. And actually, after the full-scale invasion, so many businesses from eastern Ukraine moved to Kyiv, so many people were internally displaced, that actually there was a very sharp rise in the amount of new businesses opening up in Kyiv. And now, it's just in a very confident moment. I went to, several different restaurants, all different cuisines. One of them Crimean Tatar, one of them Israeli, one of them traditional pre-Soviet Ukrainian cooking, and then Japanese and American as well. There's just such a large spread. But I think there's a very, very, very strong sense of confidence about the food that they're cooking, and there's no sense of catching up with the rest of the world. It's more that they're experimenting and doing things that I'm not seeing anywhere else in restaurants here in the UK and in Europe, in mainland Europe. So there's no sense of provincialism about it at all. It's very, very confident.
Julia Lassiger, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, and thanks too to the producers Vincent McAviney, Laura Kramer and Monica Lillis. Our researcher was Sana Jimani, our studio manager Flynn Simons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. Chris Chermack is your host for that, and he'll be bringing you the latest on the Democratic National Convention. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow, but for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.